Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, former NFL scout and currently of Sports Info Solutions, joined by Aaron Schatz, the godfather of football analytics and the founder of Football Outsiders. Today, we will be joined by Corey March, our business development lead at Sports Info Solutions and our resident fantasy expert. We're going to talk about some fantasy players that have their value in flux at this part of the year, some risers and fallers, and get some of the feedback from both Aaron and Corey that you need to get set for your fantasy drafts and make your early season adjustments. We got to start off with Antonio Brown as usual, because I'm sure you guys were pleased to see on Hard Knocks, Antonio Brown say, men lie, women lie, analytics don't lie. He was talking about you, right, Aaron?
He loves himself some catapult, doesn't he? Yeah. Hey, man, for years we had Antonio Brown as the number one receiver in the game. What did we have? At one point, he was the number one receiver in DYAR on short passes and the number one receiver in DYAR on deep passes, and nobody else was in the top 10 in both.
That's pretty crazy. By the way, sidebar, I love the article on Football Outsiders this week that came out breaking down all the different route types and the different receivers by effectiveness by route type. Always one of my favorite articles every year, and I thought you guys nailed it as usual. Thank
you. We love writing it, and it's got all kinds of interesting tidbits in it. Mostly, of course, backing the idea that they should stop throwing so many wide receiver screens, that the play is nowhere near as efficient as coaches seem to think it is. And by the way, one of the players who has, been thrown way too many wide receiver screens over recent times is Antonio Brown.
Analytics don't lie.
Analytics don't lie. Men do. Women do. Analytics don't lie.
All right, well, let's break it down. Let's get into these different positions and some of these different fantasy boom and bust candidates as guys move up and down. And one guy whose value I think is in flux as much as anybody is Andrew Luck. I don't think anybody really knows the status of that injury. We asked John Barros about it, and he basically said to us, it's not an injury that was on film, so he can't give any film analysis that really breaks it down. And everybody's kind of really just wondering. My question for you guys is, and I'll start off with you, Aaron, how do you think that injury plays into his value, and what do you make of that as you put together your projections?
It's tough. I would be very afraid of Andrew Luck because of the way that they treated his injury 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we were constantly not given information. We were told he would be back for the start of the season. Then it was going to be he would play most of the season. Eventually, he played none of the season. And I feel like we're going through that same thing again with the lack of information here about what's going on with Luck's injury. So I would be, really scared to take him. Look, if he plays, we had him as the number 2 quarterback in our projections until things started happening with this injury. So, he should be a top fantasy quarterback if he plays for the whole year, but it's so questionable at this point.
Corey, what was your perspective on Luck and really the rest of the Colts and how that kind of relates together?
I feel like with Andrew Luck in fantasy, you really need to take a stance. Is he going to be affected by the injury, or is he not going to be affected by the injury? We really don't have the information to make that determination. So it's kind of down to the individual and what the path is that they want to go with it. Because if he's healthy and he's starting week 1, which I think he probably will be, but I was probably saying the same thing at this point, and then he went on to miss the entire year in 2017. But if he is healthy, then you're in good shape to draft their skill position players. T.Y. Hilton, especially Nyheim Hines in a full powered Colts offense is a really appealing running back option. But if you start to get into a dicey quarterback situation there, you have to move those guys down the board. They become a lot less viable. When you're comparing 2017 to 2018, without Andrew Luck in 2017 compared to last year when they did have a healthy Andrew Luck, they threw for 85 less yards per game, 26 less total touchdowns. That affects the guys around him. That affects the skill position players, definitely from a fantasy perspective. So you have to keep that type of a thing in mind when you're drafting.
When it comes to Luck, and this comes to all the players who are sort of questionable at this point, so it comes, with the holdouts that we'll talk about the holdout players in a second. I feel like when you do projections like we do at Football Outsiders, readers want you to deliver them a cheat sheet that they can basically go off of in order. But when it comes to players like this, there's no way to do that. You have to, like Corey said, you have to take a stance about whether these guys are going to play and you're going to draft them and try to get the upside, or they're not going to play and you're going to avoid them. And there's no amount of cheat sheet preparation that projections can do to make that decision for you, because we aren't in Melvin Gordon's head. We aren't in Andrew Luck's head. We don't know exactly what's going on in these situations. So we can't project. And even if we could project, like let's say I projected what Andrew Luck was going to do, but we knew he was only going to play 10 games, not 16. Well, how much that's worth to you depends on your own personal strategy for how you like to fill your bench. Would you rather play the same quarterback for all 16 weeks, or would you rather have to spend an early pick to make sure you have a good bench quarterback because you know you're not going to have Luck for the first 6? I can't tell you what your strategy is. You have to have your own strategy because only you can play like you.
I will tell everybody their strategy, and in my opinion this year, I'm on the record as not being a fantasy guy really, but just taking a look at it and looking at all the quarterbacks around the NFL, especially when you consider these run threat guys and how those guys have enhanced value as fantasy players. I think the strategy this year has to be, unless you're in a 2-quarterback league, stay away from all these guys until late, because you're going to get somebody. I wouldn't invest in Andrew Luck when you've got a chance at getting a starting running back or wide receiver. But, late in the draft, I think there's huge upside there. And I kind of put my money on Chris Ballard's poker face. I think that this whole thing, there's been a lot of criticism in the media about he's injured. This is a problem. This happens every year. I think that if I'm Chris Ballard, if I'm Frank Reich, I'm really comfortable with every year nobody having any idea what's going on except me. I like that strategy from where it puts me in their shoes, but I agree. I don't see how you could bet high on any quarterback, especially somebody with an injury like this. I don't see where the value is there. All right, let's take a step forward. I just mentioned some running quarterbacks, and there's no running quarterback that gets more publicity than Lamar Jackson. Corey, what do you make of Lamar Jackson's fantasy value this year?
Last time I was on the podcast, I talked about Lamar Jackson as one of those late round fantasy quarterback targets. Since that time, about a month ago, he's been climbing up the quarterback ADP boards, and I think it's for good reason. So there's been a narrative growing. The original narrative was Lamar Jackson can't throw the football. How is he going to be a starting quarterback? That you can have any confidence in. Then there's kind of been a recent narrative that people are overreacting to the fact that Lamar Jackson can't throw the ball, saying that he is a competent passer. I don't think that the latter part is true. I think maybe people are overreacting in both cases. He was last in the league in on-target throw percentage last year. I think that's basically what you're going to get. You're not relying on him to throw the football to win you fantasy games. You're relying on him as a runner. When he became the starter in week 7 and week 11 last year and played out the rest of the season, if you take those rushing stats and extrapolate them over the entire season, you get 1,200 rushing yards and 9 touchdowns, which are top 5, top 10 in terms of pure rushing output among all players in the league. And you add in a little bit, you sprinkle in a little bit of passing value on top of that. And if he's going, kind of as a bench quarterback in terms of ADP, you can grab that, and that's league winning potential upside.
Yeah, everybody's a bench quarterback. Drew Brees is almost a bench quarterback, right?
If he runs as much as he did last year. And I had a hard time projecting this one because if you do prorate those games to a whole season, he runs so much more than any quarterback in NFL history. He puts Bobby Douglas to shame. So, we tampened that down a bit in our projection. We end up with him running 155 times for 847 yards, which 6 rushing touchdowns, which still would be among the 4 or 5 best rushing seasons ever by a quarterback. But I think we're expecting Baltimore to pass more with Jackson and run less than they did in those last 7 games of last year. And oddly, that makes him a less attractive fantasy quarterback than if he ran more and passed less.
All right. It's that old fantasy versus reality split there. All right, let's take a look ahead and let's go to some of these more classic runners. The running back position, of course, And let's start off with those holdouts that Aaron mentioned before. Ezekiel Elliott, Zeke who, what do we make of that situation? And is there actually value in Tony Pollard at this point?
I think there's a lot of value in Tony Pollard at this point, but again, you're taking a big risk. It's a gamble because you're gambling that Ezekiel Elliott is going to be out for a lot of the season. I doubt strongly that if Elliott comes back, that Dallas is suddenly going to go into some sort of running back share situation. I think if Zeke comes back, Zeke goes back to being the workhorse.
I don't disagree with you there. I do think that even if Zeke comes back, Tony Pollard is still a guy worth rostering. If Zeke is out, he enters the every week starter conversation easily.
But I think he's only worth rostering as a what if Zeke gets injured possibility. He's not someone you're ever going to start even in a bye week. Right.
Probably right off the bat, without knowing what he's going to bring on a week-to-week basis, I wouldn't consider starting him without some more information. But the Zeke who quote was probably my second favorite Jerry Jones quote of last week. He also said, in regard to Jones, in regard to Pollard and Zeke, he said, I can picture those guys in the same sets at the same time and really giving the defense fits. So I looked into that a bit further to see what type of versatility Tony Pollard has in his game. And looking at his college stats over the 3 seasons that he played at Memphis, he caught 124 passes from he had 124 targets from the slot, the most by any running back last year.
Given all of the analytics that have been done, and a lot has been published in the last couple of weeks about running backs in the by Ben Baldwin and then Stephen Ruiz about the value of running backs in the passing game not being as efficient as wide receivers or tight ends, even if you're only looking at third downs, even if you're only looking at first downs, even if you're only looking at passes from the slot. I think the whole let's get both of our running backs on the field and we'll confuse the defense concept is severely overrated. Unless one of them is Alvin Kamara.
Yeah, I was going to say, we got Kamara's doing things. We got Tariq Cohen doing things. I kind of we used to call that in New Orleans the old Pony 21 personnel grouping. And that's when we would have, Mark Ingram and Darren Sproles on the field together or whatever that was.
I think it's a little overrated.
Yeah, I mean, I do too. I think when you're talking about Tony Pollard playing behind Zeke, you're probably looking at a pretty similar situation from a fantasy perspective to Nyheim Hines.
I'm just saying, is it overrated from a fantasy perspective? Is it overrated as a strategy?
No, I mean, it's overrated as a strategy for actually winning football games. If you are going to use your running backs like that, then suddenly you are giving your second running back fantasy value. So from a fantasy perspective, it suddenly gives that second back value. I mean, from an actual football perspective, it seems to me like that's just not the best way to use your personnel. Your third wide receiver is probably going to be more efficient than putting your second running back out there in the slot.
I'm not sure I agree with you on that one. I think we'll have to agree to disagree here, because for me, if you have players that have versatility to be able to line up out wide or put them in the backfield, I think you can do a lot of things that manipulate the defense that end up helping the value of, say, your third receiver for that sort of thing, or your.
But I think you only need one running back who can do that. If the goal is to make them play their base personnel and then suddenly go 5 wide on them, you don't need 2 running backs who could split out for that. You only need 1 running back who can split out for that.
Right. And then, anytime you have two running backs, you're dividing out your concepts that way. So, say you keep Mark Ingram in the backfield and you split out your Darren Sproles type like that, you can still maintain your running advantage. And then you have the option of that guy out in space. Also, you can motion him back into the backfield, and then you can do some of your 2-back stuff. Where you can use misdirection and that sort of thing. I think that's one of the great things about Lamar Jackson is you don't have to put a second running back because you've got somebody. He is your second ball carrier in that sense. Going back to some of these old school concepts, having 2 running threats coming from the backfield on the same play. I think that's why we see jet motion so in vogue right now. I think this is single wing stuff that's coming back and cycling around.
I guess I would rather use jet motion than have 2 running backs. But I'd rather use a wide receiver in jet motion than have 2 halfbacks.
Well, and that brings up a good point. What is Tariq Cohen? Should we be calling him a running back or a slot receiver at this point? Because I'm not even sure where he's lining up more.
He's a player that we actually wanted to bring up today because the Bears have talked about, Nagy has said he wants Cohen to actually get a little less usage than he got last year. So from a fantasy perspective, it really feels like everybody is pointing to the Bears putting all their chips on David Montgomery and Mr. Broken Tackle, Mr. I played behind the worst offensive line in college, and lowering both Cohen and Mike Davis on your cheat sheets.
I don't know if I buy that. I would think on early downs, I believe that Montgomery, they don't want Cohen to, they probably want Cohen to be on somewhat of a pitch count with regards to how many carries he's going to get. But I would think in 11 personnel, they want to be Cohen all day long. And then they can actually start to spread, like you were saying, if he's your only running back, it's pretty obvious to see the advantages you create there.
I guess some of it depends on how much do you want to believe what coaches tell the media. And in a lot of ways, look, that's part of doing fantasy projections. It's so much more an art than a science, because so much of fantasy projections is trying to project roles based on figuring out just how much you should believe the lies that coaches tell the media.
Quick digression on that. We've been working a lot here. Alex Vigderman has been the leader on the project, putting together college football weekly projections, which we will have available for the first time this year. Actually, they're up right now on RotoWire. They should be up and live for the week 0 games, but putting together those college football projections was
a
different trip. Let me tell you, and having 130 teams that we'll be projecting next week will be pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's 130 coaches whose nonsense you have to parse.
Yeah. If you think it's easy, you just take the NFL model and apply it to college football. You couldn't be more wrong. It's a very different science.
I don't know, Corey, do you have an opinion on Melvin Gordon versus Zeke Elliott, who you think is coming back first versus who's going to miss more games? It's really, again, it's all about trying to read tea leaves.
Yeah, no, exactly right. I don't think that it's a good strategy for either of them to hold out into the season. So if I had to guess, if I were advising them, I would advise them to both be there week 1 and ready to play. So based on what I think the logical, smart decision is for them, I think that's what these players should and eventually will do. I think, building on that topic, people have the fear of getting burned by Le'Veon Bell last year. And, in the same conversation, I think Le'Veon Bell killed all of the value to holding out from the running back position. You don't think it's going to work based on exactly. Yeah. I don't think it's going to work. I think you can put an Austin Eckler in the backfield and not really see, not the offense won't be,
that's the key for me.
Won't be too detrimental to the offense. Yeah.
The key for me is Austin Eckler's pretty good and Melvin Gordon is very good, but the difference between those two guys, I think if I'm the Chargers, I'm not biting as hard. The difference between Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard, I feel like it is more significant. And I think, it was interesting to see that they re-signed the linebacker and that he kind of went up in line for them to do the contract. I wonder if Jerry is working through an order where he wants to get through a couple of other guys, but he's got a plan for taking care of all this stuff. I would think that Zeke would come back sooner because the Cowboys have much more reason to be uncomfortable with him missing a game.
Right. You know what Eckler can do. We don't yet know, despite all the happy talk about Pollard, we don't yet know what Pollard can do.
All right, let's take a trip around one more running back situation we wanted to look into, and that is in Kansas City. Corey, what do you have there?
As recently as a few weeks ago, it sounded like Carlos Hyde was a name to look out for in that backfield mix. As time has gone on, and especially recent reports are, Carlos Hyde's kind of getting phased out of that situation to the point where he might not even make the roster. And part of that is due to the emergence of Darwin Thompson, who has really burst onto the scene lately. Not many people even knew his name until he started putting out highlights in the first couple of preseason games. But looking at his numbers, it was actually really impressive and, wasn't even on my radar. But as a receiver, and Kansas City's been talking about him earning that third down back role, he caught 23 passes last year for Utah State, which isn't a ton. But with those receptions, he averaged 15 yards per reception, 5 yards per contact after reception. So he is a tough guy to bring down. Running the ball too, 37% tackle rate out of the backfield was the 5th highest we've recorded since 2016.
So big-time numbers coming out of Utah State. Interesting guy to keep an eye on. Aaron.
Yeah, this is definitely one where I think you want to try to handcuff. Every indication is Carlos Hyde is out and Darwin Thompson is in, and that Damian Williams may not get quite as much work as people thought early on. I mean, Andy Reid has straight out said he wants a running back by committee. And you may end up where by the end of the year, Darwin Thompson is the better fantasy pick. You may end up with the idea that despite the value of the Kansas City offense, both of these guys end up with a little bit less fantasy points than you would want out of a starting running back because they're going to have to share the load so much.
Not a great proposition for me, a guy who drafted all of the Kansas City running backs in my draft this past weekend.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're going to have to play, the old, which running back is getting the points this week game.
Yeah, I'm certainly buying into the Thompson hype. I brought up the broken tackle rate, and a couple other guys on that board were Devin Singletary and David Montgomery. And I was looking at their measurables, their combine stats. So Thompson wasn't even, I don't think he was invited to the combine or didn't go to the combine, one of those two. But on his pro day, he ran a 4.5, which was faster than both of those other two guys, and bench press 28 reps. Each of the other guys bench press 15 reps. Just ridiculous amount of strength there. I know you probably don't want to overanalyze the amount of bench press reps that a running back is doing.
We are going to strike the running back bench press analysis from the record.
What I'm getting at is he's a strong
Such good stiff arms.
Let's take a quick break and hear about the SIS Data Hub and Football Outsiders Almanac. The SIS Data Hub is the premier place to view both NFL and college FBS statistics. Along with all of the standard stats, the Data Hub houses data that cannot be found anywhere else, such as route data, coverage schemes, broken tackles, pressure percentages, and more. Countless layers of filters allow users to easily view the data through different lenses that help lead to valuable insights and create compelling narratives. Sign up now to get a research tool trusted by writers, teams, and media companies like ESPN, Football Outsiders, and more. You can do so by signing up at sisdatahub.com.
Hey, this is Aaron Schatz from Football Outsiders, and I want to tell you about Football Outsiders Almanac 2019, celebrated as the best annual guide to the football season. Featuring the most accurate NFL team projections, more than 500 fantasy football player projections with our Kubiak Fantasy Football preseason projection system, and expanded college football projections for the top 50 FBS teams and all 130 teams in FBS. This is our book that you know and love from every year, the most authoritative and innovative guide to professional football around, with cutting-edge statistical analysis, obsessive film study, trademark humor, tons of stats from our friends at Sports Info Solutions, like which team blitz most often, which defensive backs have the best coverage, which wide receivers play most often in the slot versus wide and how they perform, and which receivers go longest on both complete and incomplete passes. All this stuff is broken down for you. Week-by-week stats from last season, 5-year performance trends, analysis of off-season personnel changes, and probabilities on each team's chance to be a Super Bowl contender or a contender for the top pick in the 2020 NFL Draft. You can get Football Outsiders Almanac 2019 on our site, footballoutsiders.com. You can read a sample chapter about the Denver Broncos. You can buy the book in PDF form for $20, or you can go to Amazon.com and get a paperback with over 500 pages of previews for $28.95. Football Outsiders Almanac 2019, the best annual guide to the NFL and college football seasons.
All right, coming right back in, we want to talk about those wide receivers. And Aaron, your guy, Josh Gordon, is free again. What do you make of Josh this year? What can we expect from him? I don't even know where you start on this one.
Well, I mean, for people who buy the Football Outsiders Kubiak preseason fantasy projections know that we give each player a risk factor. Green, yellow, red. Like for Josh Gordon, we have to have infrared. What is redder than red? I think that Gordon's value to the Patriots is larger than his value to your fantasy team. Even last year, he only had something like 700 yards in the 12 games that he played. We're not going back to that year that he had with the 1,600 yards. That was long ago. We have him right now, when you factor in the risk, we only have him as wide receiver 44. I think he's a good, maybe third wide receiver for your team. But after that, I mean, he's not going to be Juju Smith-Schuster or Devontae Adams. That's just not – he's just not going to have that kind of amount of volume in the offense because of Julian Edelman.
Right. I think people are still caught up in the talent that he flashed, but we're getting pretty far removed from that. Last year with the Pats, like you said, he had 720 yards, but only 40 receptions. So I don't usually differentiate too much between where I, wide receivers on my draft board between standard and PPR, but this is actually a guy who he'd be a lot lower in my PPR ranks as opposed to standard.
It's because he gets so many yards per reception.
Right. And that offense isn't vacating a ton of targets. Gronk has left the team, but I feel like the usage in that offense doesn't necessarily dictate itself to that share of the offense going to Josh Gordon, who plays more on the outside.
Yeah, Brady's not throwing the ball outside. Right. I think in the routes column on Football Outsiders, he was one of the top guys on dig routes. Those sorts of kind of in between the hashes routes, which makes sense on those in-breaking routes. That's where Brady likes to go with the football.
Yeah, we have him projected for 905 yards and 6 touchdowns, which, again, he's not a wide receiver 1 or 2 for your fantasy team. He's a wide receiver 3. He's a flex. He's a guy you plug in during bye weeks. His natural talent versus his role in the offense it's much more exciting from a football perspective of what it means for the Patriots than it is from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, if you're drafting him based on the name, you're probably going to be disappointed. If you're drafting him, if he's on your draft board based on the projected stats, then you're probably not going to end up with him because somebody's going to end up reaching for him.
I think that's true.
Interesting. All right, stay away, all you smart, sharp players out there. Let's take a look around and see Emmanuel Sanders. Corey, what is your information on Emmanuel Sanders that you can tell us?
Emmanuel Sanders played in the Broncos' most recent preseason game and didn't seem hampered at all by the Achilles injury. And that is a notorious injury for just ruining guys' careers. A lot of guys can't even get back on the field after an Achilles tear. But lo and behold, Emmanuel Sanders is bouncing right back. Pretty short recovery window after that injury, and putting a lot of doubters to rest.
Yeah, he's the clear number 1 in that offense. Based on the Kubiak projections versus ADP, he's currently underrated, and that's taking into account that we give him a red risk because of the injury. So I think Emmanuel Sanders is a nice pickup if you can get him.
Interesting guy there. Certainly high risk, high reward, because John Veros, he said to us he couldn't believe that he was back on the field. He was nervous about it. But then you look around and you start to add things up, and yeah, it looks like he's the clear number 1, like Aaron said. So if he can stay healthy, that could be great value there. Another guy I don't think a lot of people are talking about, but maybe sort of starting to rise up the boards a little bit, Curtis Samuel. Corey, this is a fantasy sleeper that you got your eye on?
So first off, a lot of people are talking about Curtis Samuel, just maybe not in your community of intelligence, but it's a lot of practice reports, a lot of talk, hyping up and building up Curtis Samuel that is driving people towards evaluating his stats from that sort of a slanted view. Reporters have called him unguardable. I read a tweet yesterday, I think it was Graham Barfield, talking about his separation stats according to Next Gen being unbelievable, which you have to cast a judgment here because it hasn't actually unfolded yet. And it was interesting to see he was near the bottom in yards after catch per reception, which if somebody is creating a ton of separation kind of is counterintuitive to that. So that was surprising when I saw it.
I think that you've reached a point with Curtis Samuel where he's almost become overhyped, and it's led to DJ Moore being underhyped. And I would like DJ Moore more than I would like Curtis Samuel right now. I'll bet you in a lot of leagues, Curtis Samuel is going first. And I think DJ Moore should be going first.
Yeah, I'm not tapped in with the fantasy community that well. I didn't realize so many people were talking about Curtis Samuel. If he's getting that hyped, I'm with you guys. It might be a little too much, but I do like, we were talking earlier, Cam Newton and Aaron Rodgers were not themselves last year. Both of these guys were injured throughout the year. So anybody that's catching passes from those guys potentially, I think there's value to be had. All right, let's take a look at some tight ends before we get out of here. Vance McDonald, somebody a lot of people are excited about. Aaron, what can you tell us about Vance McDonald's fantasy value?
Yeah, we have him a little bit lower than the ADP. We have him as the 11th tight end. I think that the Steelers said this week, something about not really wanting to increase his usage that much more than what he was used last year. Like, we have him projected for a little bit more than what he had last year, but I think there's a feeling among people that like Antonio Brown's receptions had to go somewhere, but I think they're more likely to go to like James Washington and Deontay Johnson than they are to really increase what Vance McDonald did. He's an interesting play among that later tight end group, but if I'm not taking one of the top 3 tight ends, I'd rather take a shot at like Hunter Henry or Evan Ingram.
I'm more interested in Vance McDonald this season. I think it's the combination of the fact that so many of those targets have been vacated and the fact that Jesse James is no longer on the team. And he was kind of keeping Vance McDonald off the field a lot of times because Vance McDonald isn't really viewed as much of a blocker. Meanwhile,
they have Xavier Grimble now to play the Jesse James role.
So that'll be the question, really, is
right.
Does he fill into that role, or is it something that ends up being where Vance McDonald does fill into those targets? Because I think reasonable minds could disagree about that.
Yes, I think reasonable minds could disagree on that, and it's very easy for you to be on the Xavier Grimble stepping into that Jesse James role, and it is also easier to see the fact that the Pittsburgh offense needs to have more options to throw the ball to, and Vance McDonald definitely offers that upside. One thing I didn't realize was how dangerous he is after the catch. He breaks a ton of tackles. He averaged the most yards after contact per attempt among all tight ends last year. A thing I didn't know, just a fun fact.
Yeah, I think he's an interesting play. I'm a little bit more with Aaron on this one. I'm interested in your Njoku, your Ebron, certainly your O.J. Howard.
I'm not an Ebron guy. We're very down on Ebron. If you look at Ebron's targets went down by half in games where Jack Doyle was healthy last year.
That makes sense. Andrew Luck's
but I think that there's big upside. I'd rather take the upside of Howard or Njoku or Hunter Henry.
With Ebron, there's the factor that you mentioned, the Doyle presence. There's the factor that Ebron's value was so reliant on touchdowns last year, and that can be a hard thing to replicate, and then throw in the whole uncertainty about Andrew Luck. And if Andrew Luck is missing time, that's definitely a position that gets hurt by that.
I'll take you guys being cool on Eric Ebron. I'll stick with my Ebron all day. I'm a big fan of him with Andrew Luck, but definitely a good point there that Jack Doyle is certainly somebody that Andrew Luck likes to look for. One more tight end on our list, and this one has to be a unanimous. We love this guy. Jared Cook down with Drew Brees. I mean, what could be better, right, Corey?
I'm happy that this combination, I'm happy that these guys paired up. Jared Cook has been a late career bloomer, and the reports out of New Orleans are just rave reviews. I think there's a ton of upside here. Jared Cook is on the rise. He's definitely in the top 10 tight ends getting drafted. The Saints throw the ball a ton to Michael Thomas in the red zone. I could see some of that getting distributed Cook's way, and I think unless they're loving Traquan Smith and he's making a big leap in his year 2 with the team, I think they're just looking for that second target, unless to complement Kamara.
We actually have Cook lower than ADP, in part because New Orleans, the Sean Payton offense, uses tight ends surprisingly less than I think people think that the Sean Payton offense uses tight ends. And maybe that changes with Jared Cook around, but since Jimmy Graham left, their usage of tight ends has gone down a lot. So we actually have Cook lower than ADP. And again, I'd rather take a shot at one of those younger guys. And it's nothing against Cook, because last year we were really super high on Cook when nobody else was, and we were right about him. And this year we've kind of cooled on him because of the sort of tight end role in the New Orleans offense.
So I'm excited to see. I do think, knowing Coach Payton, I think that he's going to plan some things around Cook that he hadn't been for some of the guys they've had there the past few years. But certainly when you're looking at projections, looking at how much the team has given opportunity to players of the same position in the past, that's got to be the main driving factor. So I see where you're at on this one. I love what the Saints have done in terms of building their receiver group. Michael Thomas is kind of, he's their Michael Jordan of the crew. They've got Traquan Smith running deep. They've got Jared Cook to work the middle of the field. They've got Kamara, who's the best receiving running back in football. So you kind of see how they've assembled their basketball team of different sorts of roles, different sorts of receivers. And I think that could be really interesting to see how the offense actually looks a little bit different than it has the past few years because of some of these changes. That'll be something definitely to keep an eye on. All right. Before we get out of here, Corey, is there any other fantasy words of wisdom that you want to impart upon the listeners?
That is a tough one. Nothing specific. Draft Darwin Thompson.
All right. On that note, draft Darwin Thompson. We will get out of here. As a reminder, please help us to spread the word about the Off the Charts Football Podcast. If you like what we're doing here, please help support us. Tell your friends, write a review, and you can always hit us up on Twitter. We are at sportsinfo_SIS and at FB Outsiders. If you're interested in following more of Corey and his fantasy takes, he is at March Madness 26. You can look there for all kinds of great fantasy/gambling advice. Don't tell his wife. And for my co-host, Aaron Schatz, and our producer, Justin Stein, I'm Matt Manocherian, and thank you for joining us for the latest episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast.